Good morning. I hope this finds you well and that you've enjoyed your Labor Day weekend. I will be giving my concluding lecture shortly about Mesopotamian/Sumerian culture. But let me begin, as usual, with a few announcements. Remember that you have a short paper due by the end of the day today. You needed to have done the As You Learn post by today's class, but remember also that you have short paper 1 due today. There is always either a quiz or a short paper due at the conclusion of a unit. We're concluding the unit on ancient Sumerian culture with a short paper. The topic is found in As You Learn. You'll find the question and the prompt there. It's 1 page, single space. And it is to be uploaded in either Word or PDF format directly to As You Learn, and it's due by the end of the day. If you have questions, don't hesitate to be in touch, but please remember to do it. The next announcement is simply that on Friday we will begin the next unit, which is on ancient Chinese culture and focusing on a new text or a new cultural artifact, which is a work of Chinese philosophy called The Analects by the philosopher Confucius. And I will be making a version of that available later today online. You'll have a reading assignment for Friday. And I remind you that on Friday we will there will be either a recorded lecture or a Zoom meeting for those who are interested. So I will get all of that information put up on As You Learn later today. So today what I'd like to do is to say a few things about ancient Sumerian religion. Remember that what I had spoken about up to now is various aspects of the society of the ancient Sumerians viewed through the lens of what an agricultural surplus makes possible, which allowed us to talk about a complex society, the development of religion, the development of government, and most importantly, perhaps, the development of writing. Today, I'd like to dwell a little bit more on ancient Sumerian religion, and remember that the ultimate purpose of all that I am presenting to you is to get you to think about how this relates to the book that you're reading, the Epic of Gilgamesh. To what extent does knowing this information about Sumerian society help you understand that book better? And alternatively, how does the Epic of Gilgamesh help you understand this society better in turn? So let me say then a few things about ancient Sumerian religion as an important inroad, in a sense, to their culture. And I'd like to just sort of begin with a sort of hymn that we have to an ancient Sumerian god. And remember that a major difference between the Sumerians and the Lascaux people is, of course, that the Sumerians had writing, so that we actually have texts from this people written in Sumerian and written in the alphabet known as cuneiform that has been decoded. So we know we have texts from them. We know things that they said, as you know from reading Gilgamesh. So let me read this to you. And my question is simply, what can you tell about this people from this particular text? What conclusions can we reach about their beliefs? The hymn reads as follows: Enlil's commands are by far the loftiest. His words are holy. His utterances are immutable. The fate he decides is everlasting. His glance make the mountains anxious. His, and then there's an illegible word, reaches into the interior of the mountains. All the gods of the earth bow down to Father Enlil, who sits comfortably on the holy dais, whose lordship and princeship are most perfect. So think about this for a moment. How can you use this as a source for achieving a better understanding of this ancient society. And I'll pause for a second, but just what clues do you find in here that reveal to you beliefs, assumptions, and so on of this ancient people? You might reach a few conclusions. You might point out that Enlil is regarded as the highest god, but that, of course, points to the fact that there are multiple gods. You might find that there are beliefs about the god's ability to drive the forces of nature, or perhaps that this text contains sort of what you might call moral or ethical beliefs. Such as the idea that human beings have predetermined fate. So there's any number of possible beliefs that you might derive from this. Let me see if I can sort of spell out for you a few more specific beliefs about that the Sumerians had that we can consider to be part of their religious system. So one thing that seems to be clear about the Sumerians is, first of all, they have gods, a very common religious belief, of course, and they, especially at an early stage in Sumerian development, seem to have equated these gods with forces of nature. Scholars who have studied them seem to have concluded that the gods are almost kind of like motors or engines that are seen as the sort of secret forces that drive different natural features or different aspects of nature. For instance, there is a god called An or Anu. I'll be saying more about him, who is seen as driving heaven. Okay, when you look at the sky, you see the clouds move, you see the stars change location over time. Something must be moving that. For the Sumerians, it is Anu. There is also a god called Apsu who drives sweet water. I'll be saying more about what sweet water means, but it seems to refer to something kind of like the water one finds in rivers, such as the Tigris or Euphrates. While you look at those rivers, you see the current. Something must be driving that. It's Apsu. Interestingly, there is a god, you might say, not exactly for beer, but for fermentation. Perhaps some of you are majors or considering majors in fermentation sciences, which is, of course, a degree that App State offers. It's connected to the chemistry department. Well, this was, of course, a preoccupation of the Sumerians, and something that can happen to barley if you moisten it and so on is that it will ferment in such a way that eventually makes brewing and beer possible. Just like there were forces that drive the river and forces that drive the heavens, there must be a force that drives that particular natural process. And the Sumerians called it Ceres, the god of, again, not just beer, but the sort of fermentation process itself is known as Ceres. Another way to think about the gods is not just as means to explain natural phenomenon, but politically. This is, I think, very, very interesting. It's almost like human beings create for themselves a supernatural ruling class, a class that they see as ruling them. And I think it's interesting to sort of ponder the question of why human beings would sort of imagine themselves as subordinate to a class of people that in many respects are invisible to them. The gods increasingly came to embody, in other words, not just natural forces, but principles of authority. For example, the cuneiform character for divinity, remember that originally cuneiform is pictographic, meaning that the symbol represents a thing, then it becomes ideographic, where the symbol represents an idea. And at that stage, the sort of idea of a star is associated with leadership. So the symbol for star is that which is high or that which is elevated. Sorry, and it's not leadership; it's divinity. Okay, so this becomes the way of referring to a god. So the gods are also modeled on humans, but humans belonging to a sort of divine ruling class that rules over other human beings, that rules over the human beings that inhabit this world, the world of the here and now. The Sumerian gods eat, drink, copulate, so in that sense they're like humans. They carry out human activities, yet they're seen as having superior powers. And of course, needless to say, the Sumerians Sumerian religion is a polytheistic religion that is founded on a belief in multiple gods. Another way to think about the Sumerian gods is as what I like to call local boosters. Just as modern American towns will have business organizations that are designed to promote their cities, to draw people to them, to sort of praise their qualities. You can think the gods of the Sumerian gods as fulfilling a similar function. They existed to promote the values and virtues of particular Sumerian city-states, and were thus closely connected to, at least some of these gods were closely connected to the city-state with which they were associated. What I'd like to do right now is to take a moment or two, or a few minutes, to describe what the Sumerians called their main triad. It's not exactly a parallel to the Christian Trinity, but nonetheless, there definitely was a kind of hierarchy of gods for the Sumerians, and there were three gods who were sort of at the top of this hierarchy that each had a different function. And I think this is worth thinking about as well. What does this particular triad of divinities tell us about the Sumerian belief system? In the triad, the one god is known as An or Anu, and you could think about Anu or An as sort of the father god. But in fact, you might even, if you wanted to compare it to our culture, you might think of the god as sort of more the grandfather or the ancestor god, in the sense that they are seen as the god from whom power and authority derives. They're not the god who currently holds that authority, but they're the tradition, the past, if you will, that is seen as being the source of all power and all authority, and perhaps the force that continues to guarantee the existence of power or authority in the current world. So An or Anu is not the person who holds power, but the sort of force from which power derives or originates. The god that is actually seen as embodying power is known as Enlil. And this is the god referred to in the hymn that we read together at the beginning. Enlil is the sovereign authority, the source, or the embodiment at present, in the here and now, of power. His father is the source or origin of power, the sort of font from which power arises, but the person who holds it and wields it right now is Enlil. But interestingly, there is a third component to this divine triad, associated with Enki, sometimes called Ea. Enki is, you might say, the sort of cunning, clever sidekick. He's not in of himself a source of authority. He's an advisor to Enlil, but one who has the distinct characteristics, particularly in certain Sumerian myths that we'll talk about, of being clever, cunning, someone who thinks on his feet, and who's not only intelligent but sort of knows how to negotiate power in difficult situations. Enki, in other words, is the god who ensures that power is always mixed with intelligence. I'd like to talk about sort of two Sumerian myths, and also to point out that these myths are belong in a sense to kind of what you might describe as general families of myths or general types of myths. In particular, I'd like to start with what's called a cosmogony. This is not a term that's unique to the Sumerians. It's a term from religious studies. Cosmos is the term that means the universe or the world, in the sense of everything that exists. And then ogeny at the end means the origins of. So cosmogony is a myth that is an account, a story of the origins of the cosmos, of the origins of the world. And I would point out that it is, in the case of the Sumerians, less developed than it is for other societies, but it is based on the sort of following idea. For the Sumerians, in the beginning, there is not nothingness, but rather chaos. And the way that I would describe this is there's a kind of primal chaos in which there is stuff, there is matter in the world, but it's all kind of sort of spreading around space. It's kind of spinning around chaotically around space. The stuff that is spinning around is not even formed or does not even sort of come together into clear objects, to clear entities, to clear elements, but it is itself kind of unformed. So there's this kind of, sort of primal kaleidoscope, if you will, a sort of chaos that doesn't sort of amount to anything. And the first divine act is to separate that chaos into sort of clear and stable and coherent regions, you might say. And the basic way that this is done is dividing it into what's higher and to what's lower. What's higher is heaven, that which is on high, which is associated with the god An. And what is below is both the earth and what is known as hell or the underworld, of which Enlil is king. And if you think about the book of Genesis in the Jewish and Christian tradition, you have kind of a version of this when the description is given of a God that in the beginning created the heavens and the earth. It's a similar kind of concept, if you will, for the ancient Sumerians. And if you want a sort of sense of what this looks like, this picture more or less captures it. This picture is not meant to apply specifically to the Sumerians, but is meant to sort of present a general picture of the belief system of a number of early societies. But you see how you have the heavens on top, which for the Sumerians would be associated with Anu, and then down below you have both the earth and the underworld. And for the Sumerians, the earth kind of rests upon what they call sweet water, which is basically fresh water that might be associated with, say, the Tigris and the Euphrates, but it's surrounded by bitter water, which is kind of the primeval ocean. Bitter water meaning sort of the salt water associated with the sea. So this is kind of their picture of the world. and their cosmogony is an attempt to explain how it came about. In addition to cosmogonies, many societies have what's called an anthropogeny. If cosmogony is an account of the origins of the cosmos or the world, and anthropogeny is an account of the origins of anthropoi, which mean human beings. These languages are from the ancient Greek. So an anthropogeny is the story of once the world exists, how do human beings come to exist within it? Now, the Sumerians have an anthropogeny that is a sort of fascinating text, a fascinating story that I will describe to you in just a moment. It's from another Sumerian epic that's called the Epic of Atrahasis, also known as the Poem of the Super Sage, and it's from about 1700 BCE, meaning not quite 4,000 years old. I will continue to flip with my slides, but I'll try and sort of tell you the basics of the story, not following the slides too closely. In the beginning, for the Sumerians, there was in fact a society that existed before human society that is a purely divine society. The Sumerians are polytheists. They believe in a multiplicity of gods. So it's the first society is a society in which there are many and an abundant number of gods. Interestingly, these gods are divided into what you might call two social classes. At the top, there are the leader gods who, interestingly, are also the consumer gods. In other words, those who lead are also the ones who consume the goods that this society produces. Gods in the Sumerian system do need to eat and drink and so on. And then there's a lower rank of gods who are both sort of the followers, if you will, but also the producers. They're the ones who actually produce, in other words, the goods that the higher ranked gods consume. What happens is an uprising. The sort of the major event in the story of this divine society is that the producer gods rebel against the higher ranked gods. They go on strike, they destroy their tools, and they specifically protest against the reign of Enlil. This creates a kind of crisis that the leader gods, the higher ranked gods, have to address. So they call a divine assembly, and they talk amongst themselves about how they can address this threatening uprising of the lower ranked gods. Enki, who is always the clever god, Enlil's cunning advisor, proposes an intriguing solution. He says, basically what we need to do is to give full rights to the lower ranked gods, sort of eliminate the class division, but to do that, we need to create another creature, another being that will do the work that the lower ranked gods once did. This being needs to be hardworking, to have some intelligence, enough intelligence to carry out productive work, and to be obedient, to be subservient to the gods. This creature, of course, is man. So there is a very sort of conscious choice that is made by the Sumerian gods, if you will, to create man as a solution to a labor problem. It's because the lower ranked gods no longer want to do the subservient productive work that a special creature must be invented, must be created to do that work. And that is the purpose of human beings for the Sumerians. How do you create this being? Well, the way that you do it is you take some clay, and I would again stress the importance of clay to the Sumerians. It's what they make bricks out of so that they can build ziggurats. It's what they use to put inscriptions on so that you can have cuneiform tablets. It's also what human beings fundamentally are. They are clay, except that Enlil sort of mixes into the clay a little bit of blood of a lower ranked god. So combination of a bit of a lesser divinity, of the blood of a lesser divinity with some good Tigris or Euphrates clay is what human beings are made out of. Once human beings have been made in that way by the gods, they are then put to work. The former subservient gods are freed from their labors. The gods have a new subservient producer creature. It would appear that things are going well. The crisis has been resolved, except for one problem. There is one major problem that the Sumerian gods have with their newly created creature, with newly created human beings. Think about that for a moment. What do you think in this society would be the problem that humans cause gods? And I would just sort of suggest, as you think about that this might be kind of an interesting clue about how the Sumerians understand human nature and the problems associated with human nature if the issue of the problem that the gods have with human beings in this myth can be seen as kind of a indicator of their anxieties or reflections on the nature of human existence. You might have thought, well, that perhaps human beings have a tendency to evil. You might thought that they have a tendency to be disobedient or rebellion, despite being created supposedly without such tendencies. And those would be good ideas. Interestingly, though, they're incorrect. It's, in fact, a far more prosaic or sort of ordinary problem that the gods have with human beings, which is simply they are too noisy. Human beings make a lot of noise. And the gods in general, and Enlil in particular, no longer can sleep because of the racket, the constant noise created by a world now populated with human beings. So, consequently, Enlil has to find a way to address this problem, and in a kind of fit of anger, after trying to wipe out human beings in various ways, he does what you do. He pulls the best trick in the book of an ancient Middle Eastern god, which is to have a massive flood. And of course, as you probably can think of, and as you may have heard, flood myths are very common in the ancient Middle East, and famously are surface in the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures as well, in the form of the Noah story. And I'm simply just sort of presenting this as a sort of a myth that some scholars consider to be kind of a predecessor, an antecedent of the Noah story in the Old Testament. So Enlil decides to wipe men out with a massive flood. This flood will only be effective if its imminence, if the fact that it's coming is hidden from humans. So the gods are sworn to secrecy, that they will not tell anybody about this. However, Enki betrays the secret. And Enki, again, always the clever god, decides to inform a human being with whom that he's particularly close to, who might be described as kind of his protege, as a human being that he's kind of taken under his wing to give guidance to, who was known as the super sage. He's not just a sage, he's not just wise, he's especially wise, so he's known as the super sage. And Enki appears to this so-called super sage in a dream. And Enki in particular conveys to the human the idea of saving the human race by selecting a few people and building an ark or a large boat that can protect the human race from this flood. And by the way, it's always important when you hear these stories to think about how is it that we know them? What is the source of our knowledge of these tales? And it's the picture that you see to the right here. This is the so-called flood tablet, which is a one account of the sort of flood that is associated with this myth. And you can see that it's carved into stone, and its characters are cuneiform. So the plan works. The human race survives despite the flood. Enlil is outraged. Enki makes up and apologizes in a sense for his disobedience, although Enki did sort of probably reasonably suspect that without human beings the gods would not have the labor force that they need. But he agrees to sort of atone or make up for his disobedience by improving humankind in a way that will be appreciated by Enlil and the other higher up gods. So the importance here is that there is a notion of, to use a technical term, of what post-diluvian human beings are. Post-diluvian is a fancy word that means after, post the flood, diluvian. And post-diluvian human beings have high levels of infant mortality. Many children will die at childbirth, or will be born dead, and high levels of female sterility. In other words, women, a larger number of women will not be able to bear children. Human life is also considerably shorter. Why was this necessary? So that Enlil could sleep. Remember the basic problem of the noisiness of human beings, in part tied to their abundance. This is a device for reducing the number of human beings and thus reducing the racket that they cause. But it becomes associated with this quite sort of dark view of how human beings are going to be after the flood. They're not only the labor force for the gods, but they now have a life that is exposed to death and sterility, and that is short. And the reason, of course, for those is because it's necessary to please the gods. So I think this is a very interesting story. I'm actually going to skip the next slide, and I would just sort of encourage you to think for a moment about what we can learn from this story about Sumerian ideas and thoughts. How is this myth in itself a kind of source about the Sumerians? Several things you might want to consider. That it does see human beings as having a purpose, but a purpose that is entirely tied up with obedience and service to sort of fairly demanding and unforgiving divinities. You might also sort of think about the fact that it's a sort of vision of human life that does sort of emphasize the role of sort of pain and discomfort. A certain amount of suffering and the brevity of life itself is a consequence of the God's willingness to not wipe the human race out. So I think these are things that are worth considering. And again, I would just sort of generally encourage you to sort of think about myths like this as sources about that particular society. I'm going to sort of move along here, and I want to say a few things about the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, about which, of course, you were writing an essay for this afternoon, for the end of the day. I just, again, want to remind you that when you think about this book, you might think about the physical copy of the book if you purchased one, or you might think about the online version of it that you read. But it's, again, always sort of important to ask yourself the question, how do we have it at all? How do we have access to a text that is 4,000 to 5,000 years old? Well, again, as I said about the Flood Tablet, the reason is because at a certain point Gilgamesh was written down, and consequently we know the text because we have the sort of physical objects unto which it was recorded. And those, of course, are tablets. So when you see the text, the online text is being divided up into tablets, that's not just some sort of abstract conception of a chapter, a sort of arbitrary subdivision. That actually refers to what could sort of fit onto a physical stone tablet of a certain kind. So, for example, what you're seeing right here in this picture is tablet 5 of one version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And although it's very small and sort of hard to decipher, the inscriptions that you can see in this stone are is the sort of cuneiform version of Gilgamesh. A few sort of comments about the text, some basic facts about the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was what I would call sort of an internationally known work of literature in Mesopotamia for well over 1,000 years. I say international because its appeal extended beyond a single people. It was, if I'm not going to go into great depths about this, but I think I mentioned that sort of the sort of first people that we know about that inhabited ancient Mesopotamia were the Sumerians. At a certain point, the Sumerians are kind of brushed aside and sort of taken over by this Semitic people called the Akkadians. The Akkadians are replaced by the Babylonians, who are replaced by the Assyrians, who are replaced by a new round of Babylonians, and who are then replaced by a new round of Assyrians. I'm being extremely simplistic in talking about this, but it's important to understand that there are these different societies and cultures that kind of rise and fall during the ancient period in Mesopotamia. But many of them share, despite being different peoples, and even having different languages and so on, many of them share a sort of a certain common culture, and that includes they all use cuneiform as a system of writing, even though their languages are different, and they accept certain stories and myths that originate with the Sumerians, but are then kind of passed on, and one of those is Gilgamesh. So that's what I mean by saying that it's kind of internationally known. It's, I'd have to think about sort of what a sort of equivalent to that is. It might be that, sort of different societies originating from Europe sort of have different accounts of sort of Santa Claus that have existed over hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's variations on it, but they all sort of share a sort of basic story. Maybe Gilgamesh can be thought of as something like that. It's a story that sort of continues in its various forms, through a long history associated with this region, even as particular peoples come and go. The oldest version does go back to the Sumerians, however. It's from roughly 1800 BCE, making it slightly older than the Super Sage story. But one of the more recent versions is from the 7th century BCE, so it's over 1,000 years later than the first one. So the one that I've asked you to read is sort of tied to the oldest version, but it's important to understand that there are these different versions. It was written down in several different Mesopotamian languages, meaning languages of Mesopotamia, including Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and so on. And it was recorded on sort of clay and stone tablets, written in the cuneiform script. So there's a lot to discuss about this text, and I wish we had time to do so more. But I'm mainly going to ask you to share your thoughts in the paper that you are writing and that you'll submit in via As You Learn by the end of the day. And I would just sort of encourage you, again, to sort of think about, this is really the topic of the paper, to sort of what the relationship is between text and context, or to put differently, between text and society. You're reading a story. You're reading a kind of epic account of a Sumerian hero, Gilgamesh. It might have had any number of functions, entertainment, but perhaps also a way of sort of conveying not only religious ideas, but perhaps ideas about morality as well. But how does this relate to the society that produced it? Sort of at a basic level, what sort of clues, what sort of indicators about how society actually was set up do you find in the text? What are sort of clues or indicators of how the Sumerians lived? And can you relate these to some of the things that I've talked about in lectures? But then conversely, and again, this is sort of the other side of the hermeneutic circle, does Gilgamesh provide you with a better understanding of the society itself? Does reading the text give you insight about the people and how they lived? These are the issues that I'd like you to think about. I'm looking very forward to reading your papers. If you have any questions about them, don't hesitate to be in touch with me. Send me an email. I'm happy to talk about it. And finally, remember that in addition to completing your paper, I will be putting up readings for Friday and next week as we begin our new unit, which is going to be about ancient China. And as our cultural work, we'll be focusing on a book by an ancient Chinese philosopher called The Analects by Confucius. Good luck with your papers, and I will see you either as a recorded lecture on Friday or via the optional Zoom session. Thanks very much, and see you soon.